Hello, this is David L. Bernstein. I usually don't cite my middle initial L, but in this case, I'm going to need to because this podcast is with three David Bernstein. David E. Bernstein, who is a professor of law at George Mason University, a prolific author. You might hear more about some of the books he's written, including those on free speech. We also have David S. Bernstein, who is a book publisher with Bombardier Books and also executive editor of Wicked Sun Press, which I'm looking forward to hearing a little bit about as well. And as you know, I'm David L. Bernstein, founder of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. This may appear to be the least diverse manel in human history, but actually we are quite diverse. David S. is half black, which you could talk about maybe at some point. David E. Bernstein is married to an Iraqi Jewish woman, and his kids are half Iraqi like me. So we are much more representative of Jewish diversity than might appear on our cover. But I'm really happy to have the two of you here. I thought I'd start out with a question about this illiberal ideology that we're all talking about. I call it critical social justice ideology. Wesley Yang calls it the successor ideology. I think they're all mean the same thing. But it's the impact it has on Jews in particular and on anti-Semitism. Maybe I'll start with you, David E. What's your take on how this might fuel anti-Semitism?
Well, one problem is that while people think who are into this think they're being very much into diversity and this and that, it's a very narrow perspective which tries to understand all problems basically through the lens of black-white relationships in the United States over the last several hundred years, and Jews don't fit into that paradigm very well. Anti-Semitism is a form of racism, but it doesn't fit into the black-white racism paradigm. The classic anti-black racism in the United States is that blacks are inferior, which is why it's okay first to enslave them, then to segregate them and whatnot. Anti-Semitism tends to be a conspiracy about Jewish power. So there's nothing inherently contradictory about understanding that Jews are doing very well economically, society, but also having a lot of anti-Semitism. But if you assume that racism in all its forms has to be about the dominant group believing the lower group is inferior and keeping them at a lower socioeconomic standard, then you can't understand how anti-Semitism could coexist with Jewish success, nor could you really explain why Jews are relatively economically successful in the United States without adding to the conspiracy theory that Jews must somehow be uber whites because the whites will always be on top of the pyramid.
Right. Daphne Kaufman at the Reut Institute has been writing about this and calls it erasive anti-Semitism, in that it both sort of erases Jews from this hierarchy of privilege and makes them out to be part of the oppressor class, but also erases anti-Semitism itself, in that it treats it as if it's a non-factor and therefore not really oppressive of Jews. David S., what's your take?
Well, I agree with everything that David E. said, but let me add an additional dimension here. All of this stuff, under whatever name that you want to give it, is a form of extreme collectivism. And it's based around immutable characteristics like race and ethnic origin, and makes them very determinative of individual fate, if you will. And historically speaking, any form of extreme collectivism has led to extreme anti-Semitism. Because for many of the reasons that David E. already brought up, just Jews don't fit into an extreme collectivist paradigm. For a couple of reasons. One, because Judaism is a source of the notion of individual rights in the first place, but also in a somewhat contradictory way, Jews are exceptionalist and don't assimilate well, if you will, into extreme collectivist movements. The Jews will always be the recalcitrants that require re-education in the camps. And this has been the case since the Roman Empire. It's not new. So as Jews, even though, we feel like, the social justice, liberal Jews feel like collectivism is part of the Jewish experience, actually what they're signing on to is an ideology that's always been hostile to Judaism and Jews.
So this obviously plays out, as we saw recently in May with the war in Gaza, and how people perceive Israel. They're applying this same ideological paradigm to Israel and the Palestinians. How do you see that as a factor, if at all? Am I wrong about that?
Oh, wow. I mean, when you start talking about the Palestinian issue, which is, hardly my area of expertise, there's just so many odd dynamics at play. There's Jews that hate Israel. There's other people that hate Israel for various reasons. There's Muslim anti-Semitism. It's such a complicated dynamic. Any conversation about Palestinians is almost never about Palestinians. It's simply a proxy for something else. Somebody working out their issues on something else, using the Palestinians as a pawn for that.
I do think I actually wrote something about this for the Times of Israel recently. I've been thinking about this for a while and finally wrote it up. Why Israel gets so much attention? I'm not even talking about whether you like Israel or don't like Israel. Why compared to every other conflict in the world, and any conflict involving Israel gets so much attention? And I think that people are, in general, are fascinated by the idea of Jewish power and sovereignty after 2,000 years. And some of the people who are fascinated by it are pro-Israel, whether Christian evangelicals who think that God is blessing the Jewish people, or Jews themselves who are proud to finally have an independent state. But there are a lot of the other groups that are fascinated are anywhere from extremely uncomfortable to hostile to the idea of Jews having any collective power. There's Islam, which has historically thought of itself as at the top of the Abrahamic pyramid, and Jews are supposed to be ruled by Muslims and not vice versa. There's traditional Christian anti-Semitism, that Jews rejected Jesus and therefore they're doomed to wander the earth stateless and homeless as punishment. There are liberal Christians who think that Jews, having suffered from the Holocaust, should become martyrs to their victimhood and be basically the good Christians of the world. And they blame us for one of the most offensive forms of anti-Israel and anti-Semitic sentiment is having Jews learn from the Holocaust, as if we're the ones who are supposed to learn a lesson, as opposed to the perpetrators. Then the Jews themselves, are a lot of Jews out there who their Jewish identity is historically based on all they really got besides bagels and lox is Jews are supposed to be the victims historically, and as the victims we stick up for the underdog, whoever that might be, which is a really asinine kind of reductionist view of the world. The underdog's always right, but it does lead to this sort of idea, well, if Jews are the ones exercising power, they must be in the wrong, because that's contrary to our views of what Jews are supposed to be. And there are also the Marxists who historically have felt that Jews are sort of an illegitimate middleman ethnic group that exists only because of capitalism, and therefore if Jews are to exist as any kind of collective, their only justification is if they're going to be social justice activists. And if they're not going to be that, then they shouldn't exist at all.
Right. So there's also obviously a very simple binary here, right? That if Jews are the oppressor in this paradigm, that's obviously going to extend to Israel and the Palestinians. A writer, and I'm blanking on his name, for the Daily Beast, in condemning Mayim Bialik for the new host of Jeopardy. I'm not sure that's finalized yet, by the way, but he wrote about it. Accused her support of Israel as being a function of white supremacy. And I thought it was interesting that they took the typical critical social justice lexicon and applied it so seamlessly to the Israeli-Palestinian issue, as if Israel were a group of whites and were exhibiting white supremacy against Palestinians who were the collective black person in this paradigm. It seems But I think that's actually what's happening in the mind of the sort of the woke.
Well, look, to a hammer, they say every problem looks like a nail. Right. So this is, if you have this extremely narrow worldview where everything has to fit into this paradigm, the only way of understanding a conflict between a westernized country, if you want to call it that, and a non-westernized people is through this white supremacy paradigm. It doesn't have to make any sense. It's the only perspective you have.
Right.
Well, so, it goes back. It's not new. Of course, it goes back to the whole Zionism equals racism thing, which was a creation of the Soviet Union as anti-Israel, anti-Western propaganda, and it's lasted beyond the demise of the Soviet Union and been repackaged by the wokesters because it's effective, because it works on young, impressionable, overeducated Western kids. Jews and non-Jews alike, and who are increasingly turning anti-Israel based solely on this lie that was a creation of the KGB.
Yeah, I really want. I've talked about this a little bit. I really want to emphasize David's point because I don't think it gets nearly enough attention. That just about every propaganda point that you will read any young woke leftist saying comes directly from anti-Semitic Soviet propaganda of the 60s and the 70s. They're not aware of the origin, at least the 99% of them aren't. Right. And they will probably deny it, but it's quite obvious. I know there are one or two scholars out there working on this, but so this would be a great book for your Wicked Son Press.
Yeah.
Right. Absolutely. So Ibram X. Kendi, a professor, I think at Boston University, and the now very famous author of How to Be an Anti-Racist, has talked about equity. And under this definition of equity, any disparity is prima facie evidence of discrimination and racism. So all disparity is automatically a function of white supremacy. And it seems to me that that if all disparity that works against a community is a function of racism, then all advantage or all privilege, if you will, that a community experiences, all success that a community experiences is also a function of white supremacy as well. And Jews are one of those groups that are vastly overrepresented among the success classes, Asian Americans as well. How do you think that plays out for us in the long run if it continues to gain ground in the public discourse?
Years ago, it has to be almost 30 years ago, Daniel Farber and Suzanne Sherry wrote an essay and then a book. Well, it turned into a chapter of a book on critical legal studies and critical race theory, where they said that critical race theory is anti-Semitic implicitly for exactly that reason. So this isn't a new paradigm. They said, look, exactly what you said. If all disadvantage is the product of oppression, then all advantage is the product of privilege, since Jews are better off socioeconomically than the vast majority of groups in society, it must be a result somehow of Jewish privilege. And we know Jewish people have been discriminated against, so this must really add to the conspiratorial, it's worse. It becomes almost more anti-Semitic than even standard anti-Semitism, because the only way to explain it in that paradigm is that Jews somehow, despite being discriminated again by the establishment, has so much privilege that they can still succeed. They have it has to be some sort of a conspiracy or plot to explain it.
Yeah, and Kendi and people like that have a lot to answer for. Not just now, but really for the last 30, 40 years, the Black radical academics. Because you can see in surveys their handiwork, which is consistently the most anti-Semitic segment of the American population are college-educated Blacks, particularly people who went to more elite colleges where this sort of stuff is taught. And it's a deliberate, in my view, um, part of their ideology, which is to turn blacks and Jews against each other. And it's extremely dangerous and borderline evil.
Kendi's co-authored book, which is the one they're reading in middle school and high school, Stamped a Remix. It did not escape my attention when I read it, because it was assigned to my daughter's middle school and I had a fit about it, that all the bad guys are sort of, mainstream, what we call mainstream African-American leaders over the years, Martin Luther King, Frederick Douglass, they're all racist to Kendi. Every single contemporary or reasonably contemporary black leader he praises, Stokely Carmichael, Angela Davis, Reverend Jeremiah Wright, every single one of them is anti-Semite. He hasn't ever mentioned their views on Jews, but I just can't be a coincidence, right? That they're all anti-Semites.
Interesting. Speaking of Angela Davis, she was a student, an acolyte of Marcuse, the German thinker who came up with the idea of repressive tolerance, which is that basically we can repress ideas of the dominant culture that make it hard for that narrative to sort of come to the fore. In other words, it was the decided illiberalism of its day that probably has done more to influence our current debate on, critical race theory and the like. And it was really her influence in the American Academy that probably has done more damage than anything else I can think of. So I think, along with the Soviets and their fingerprints on this, I think it's probably Marcuse and Angela Davis spreading some of these ideas.
Well, it's very, very interesting that it seems like one of the primary purposes of contemporary, woke, radical black thinking is this ongoing effort to rehabilitate Angela Davis. You can walk into Nordstrom right now and buy an Angela Davis sweatshirt. It's really kind of bizarre. They've turned her into some sort of pop culture icon, and I'm not sure what the actual purpose is. Why her of all people? But it just shows you just how weird and topsy-turvy the world is right now.
Yeah, I agree. When I was reading Stamped a Remix, she is the heroine of the last third or so of the book. I mean, a few interesting things about it. One of which is that Kendi and his co-author treat her as some sort of, that she came up with, this radical African-American anti-racist theory. When, as you mentioned, David L., she was an acolyte of Herbert Marcuse, a German Jewish refugee, and she took her ideas pretty, she would acknowledge directly from him. He was a communist. She was a communist. So if anything, she is a conduit for white communist ideas, if you want to call them that. Also, when you say, well,
white Jewish,
right. And you say that, well, there's the Soviet Union, Angela Davis. Of course, Angela Davis was a pro-Soviet communist for much of her career, only stopping to be when the Soviet Union collapsed, and never, as far as I know, never regretting her love affair with the Soviet Union. She was the Communist Party vice presidential candidate several elections. She met with Eric Honegger. She said Soviet Jews belong in jail, and so forth and so on. But I was thinking, though, why Angela Davis? To my mind, Angela Davis's intellectual contributions are essentially zero. Right. That, like, if I was going to name someone African American in the modern era who really did have an influence, I'd say Derek Bell, for example.
Right. Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
So we are all sort of heterodox, I think, in some ways, but I think I'm probably the furthest left among you. David E., you're a libertarian, and I know you had your qualms with Trump. I don't know about you, David S., where you fell. I don't know to what degree Trump affected your political outlook. You can feel free to talk about it or not. But it seems to me one of the outgrowths of this critical social justice ideology is the possibility that the Democratic Party in America goes the direction of the Labor Party under Corbyn, and that many, many Jews who are still firmly Democrats are going to be sort of fundamentally alienated from American politics. And while that might not be explicitly or intentionally anti-Semitic, it might be sort of anti-Semitic in effect by disenfranchising large percentages of American Jews who are not going to feel comfortable in either party. They're not going to feel comfortable in a Trump-dominated Republican Party, and they're not going to feel comfortable in a woke Democratic Party that's become more explicitly anti-Israel. What are your thoughts on that view?
Well, there's a couple of things going on that are driving this phenomenon. I mean, I do think that Trump, for better or worse, did attract a lot of Jews to more conservative ideas. And what he did for Israel cannot be, overstated. On the other hand, it's not just about Trump versus the woke, right? What you're seeing is that both political parties are moving in a populist direction. One's a left populism, one's a right populism. But frankly, populism has not been good to the Jews over the years. And so when you have a party that's, a polity that's moving in purely in populist directions, a lot of Jews are going to feel disenfranchised in that sort of thing. Because frankly, Jews rely on the close relationship between Israel and the United States, American Jews in particular. And there's not necessarily room in a populist country for strong international alliances like that.
Yeah, that's certainly a factor, but probably not the only factor. If the party itself starts to sound like people that are fundamentally adversarial to them, whether it's an Ilhan Omar on the left or a Trump-style Republican on the populist right, that's not going to be a comfortable place for a lot of Jews. Some will try to make peace with whatever party. Many will. Maybe the majority will make peace with their own ideologues in their own party. But a lot are going to feel increasingly uncomfortable. It seems to me. David E., what do you think?
I think first of all that I think Jews were fortunate that the populism that was nascent in the Republican Party found its expression in Trump and not in someone who is actually personally hostile to Jews. I can easily imagine a Pat Buchanan, for example,
right.
In a different time and place, having been the standard bearer, and that would have been very bad on a whole range of levels. I think one problem we're facing, and I suppose this is contrary to my general belief in free speech, I guess I've actually come to have a little bit more respect for the establishment in a sense than I used to. As gatekeepers, obviously, I think David S. at least, and I would agree that the mainstream, the MSM as it's called, the mainstream media always leans somewhat to the left, but they at least had an ideology of trying to be fair-minded, even if they didn't know how to do that because they didn't really understand the other side. And they did keep the extremist wackos and the anti-Semites sort of outside the mainstream of discourse. Once that breaks down and it's all about how many clicks you get and whoever, and there are no gatekeepers, it just allows a lot of problematic ideas that were relegated to the fringes to become more popular, get more airtime. And it's also the case that, the old days, if you had a bunch of, crazy anti-Semites, maybe they could find a holiday, have badly mimeographed flyers they would hand out and maybe get 8 people to a holiday and conference room. Now they have the same platform on Twitter or Facebook or blogs as anybody else. So, I mean, the hope is that over time, that these things tend to, that things go to one extreme. Like right now we're in a moment of flourishing of all sorts of alternative outlets, and eventually we'll figure out how to differentiate between the fake news and the propaganda and the racism and the anti-Semitism, and come to a more mainstream, if not necessarily more moderate equilibrium. But right now we're living through all the wackos who are on the sidelines for like good 30, 40, 50 years are in their moment, and that's bad. They're getting undue influence in both parties because they're the people who one thing about the wackos, they're true believers. Right, and the true believers are the ones who will spend their time tweeting or marching and writing to their congressmen, and they get disproportionate influence that way. The rest of us have jobs and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is a recurring thing through American history, in human history, really, but especially in American history. Periods of the unum sort of falling apart. And you're right, David. It's always a question of does things get pulled not back to the center, because there's not really a center as well defined in America, but into a common language, right? There are periods where Americans are working a common purpose, and there's periods where we are doing less so. And we're in one of those less so periods now. But of course, what's changed, as you point out correctly, is that the technology exists in a way that seems to pull away from common language. So the question is, can we harness that technology in a way to do what our ancestors have always done and bring people back together? And it's not clear whether that can be done.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Jonathan Rauch, you might be familiar with him, senior scholar at Brookings, who came out with his recent book, The Constitution of Knowledge, Defense of Truth. Great book. He talks a lot about what he considers the reality-based institutions. And even though he has his own criticisms of the New York Times and the like, he still says that, look, 10-1, they're still providing some of the reality-based reporting, and we should respect that. They're still committed to the proposition of truth in some basic way, even if they've allowed themselves to become woke in certain ways as well. And that said, though, he's obviously concerned about the status of reality-based institutions, and understands that Twitter and Facebook and all these other social media channels have allowed for sort of groups and others to establish these false narratives and spread untruth and lies and the like. But he's confident somewhat that we'll get our act together, that we'll create new intermediating institutions that will then help us understand reality and come to a common understanding of what reality is and the like. I have to tell you, though, that I've bounce that off of a lot of other people in sort of the same space who are not nearly as confident, maybe precisely for the reason you said. The business model has changed. There's not 3 or 4 major institutions now that get to decide what's true and what isn't. There's hundreds and hundreds. How does that ever come back to the sort of center? How do we ever reestablish the authority of truth when you have just so many different vehicles for disseminating lies?
Well, as a libertarian, I would say this is a good reason to de-emphasize politics and do more through private social institutions, on the theory that you don't get punished in life for having just generally bad political ideas, for voting for the wrong candidates, for believing in all sorts of nonsense. But for example, if you believe that vaccines are inserting a microchip in your brain so Bill Gates can control you, you don't get vaccinated, and then you die or hospitalized for weeks, that has consequences. And people do learn from actual consequences to themselves. But I'm not either sanguine that anyone else will take this lesson. You would have thought, I was hoping that when Donald Trump got elected, I wasn't expecting it to be the dominant reaction on the left, but I thought maybe there'd be a reaction on the left. Geez, we thought the United States was completely going in a direction we like. Now it's taking a 180. Maybe we were wrong in centralizing so much power in the government. Instead, the almost universal reaction was, wow, really bad people have taken power, so we need to retake power and crush them.
Right. Right. But isn't it, in some ways, isn't the sort of the rise of ideology on both political parties in some ways disrupting the learning process? In other words, they make us less rational, irrational, even, and political parties that might have at one point in time said, "Okay, we didn't do very well last election. Now let's elect somebody who is a more middle of the road or who will help us win." That's all changing now because both parties seem captured by sort of their irrational wings, and ideology now has a much more prominent place. Am I wrong about that? That you could be wrong, that people actually won't learn about that, won't learn about their lessons from their mistakes?
I think what I was trying to say was that people will learn lessons from mistakes that actually personally cost them. Like you keep gambling on horse races and lose all your money, you may decide that maybe gambling isn't in your best interest over time.
Or you're an addict and you continue to do what hurts you.
But the fact is, if you vote for Trump and bad consequences ensue, or you vote for Rashid Tlaib and bad consequences ensue, the odds that the consequences won't be personal, and you won't really be able to attribute it to your vote because it's one of 90 million people.
Right.
So you basically, when you vote, I think there's not everyone agrees with this, but I don't think people necessarily vote in their narrow self-interest, and I don't think they even are necessarily all that what we might think of as rational. They vote in a way that makes them feel good. They say I don't understand Trump's appeal, even to people who are generally in line with his his policies. I can see liking his policies, but he's so obviously, to me, inept, corrupt, and narcissistic that I just don't get the Trump worship that some people have. But for whatever reason, he has become the embodiment of a certain worldview, America first, and and so forth, that people just have an emotional attachment to, and they overlook all that stuff. And they'll never say, "Oh, well, the bad consequences." They don't see the bad consequences are way too indirect to attribute it to their ideology. Unlike, say, you buy a bad peach in the store, you say, "Okay, from now on, I have to look out for brown spots." Right? That's pretty easy.
Well, most Trump voters I know are far more practical about it, which is consider the alternatives.
That's the people you and I know, but there are clearly lots of other people out there who aren't in our social circles.
Well, look, there were people who worship Andrew Cuomo, right? I mean, there's no accounting for taste. But the point. Let's go back to the point you made about de-emphasizing politics, because of course that's I keep saying historically over and over again, but it's true. Historically speaking, when we get into these periods, we get out of it because of a de-emphasis on politics. And it typically means that there was a religious revival of some sort, which then, of course, eventually sets off a political reaction to that religious revival. But that's further down in the cycle. Early in the cycle, the religious revival actually brings people together, and I don't mean religion in a particular sense, but in a generalist sense, where people decide that the spiritual is more important at this moment than the political.
What if wokeism is actually the religion? In other words, like I worry that what we're seeing, or QAnon, for example, that we're in such a radically different reality now because of social media and so forth, that a lot of the old rules, a lot of the old cyclical nature of our politics and social learning are now being fundamentally disrupted, and we're seeing new things that may rhyme but are not necessarily indicative of what's to come next. I don't know.
It's a distinct possibility, and we won't know until we've lived through it.
Exactly. I actually think there's an interesting potential demographic revolution going on. I am not a demographer, I haven't studied it, but just from observation of people I know and society, there seems to be a significant divergence in how many children religious people are having compared to non-religious people, which again, not a demographer, but I don't think it was as pronounced in the past. And it's already dramatically affecting the Jewish community. We haven't quite felt it because it's more the younger generation, but the Pew study that just came out shows that 25% of Jews between 21 and 35 or 39 or something are Orthodox. And that's with Pew using an extremely capacious definition of who they include as Jews. You could be someone with a non-Jewish mother, one Jewish grandparent, basically, not halakhically Jewish. You don't practice Judaism. You don't do Jewish holidays. You don't know anything about Judaism. But if you say that I consider myself Jewish in some way and don't have another religion, you're considered Jewish by Pew. So if you actually narrow that field down to Jews who actually are in some way Jewish beyond, I have fond memories of eating kreplach at my grandmother's house when I was a kid. You wind up with much more than 25%, and this is going to have dramatic. It's very bad for the Jewish community in a way if the wokesters win because they hate religion, and the Jewish community, which is now seen as a mostly kind of secular, still liberal, left-wing kind of community, is going to be seen as a reactionary community. But I'm wondering, since I could see this so obviously in the Jewish community, to what extent, I have a lot of Mormon friends in our area. They all have 4 or 5 kids. They seem to retain most of them. Whether there's going to be a new generation coming up that's going to be much more religious than we're expecting.
And that could fundamentally alter the sort of political and social equation in this country over time. You never know what's going to actually be the major factor that shifts the social discourse. It may be, a lot of individual advocacy as well, and it may be that wokeness is a sort of circular firing squad where eventually they become so absurd that they sort of obliterate themselves. I don't know. And maybe, as you said, maybe the resurgence of a religion will actually, and these new demographic realities will actually push it aside. So let's just, I'm just like to know what you're working on. We'll end there. David E., what are you working on right now?
Well, this is both of us, actually. I'm within the next month and 5 days or so, I am due to send a book manuscript, finalized book manuscript, off to my publisher, which is Bombardier Press, which is David Bernstein's press, called Classified: The Untold Story of Racial Classifications in America. And the basic idea is that we have these sort of accepted classifications that we all typically use, like Asian American, Hispanic, African American, Native American. They to a large extent, they are arbitrary and don't really make any sense. Like, why are Filipinos and Pakistanis in the same category, but Afghans and Pakistanis are not? Afghans are officially white, whereas Pakistanis are Asian, because we just drew this arbitrary line. But then they're in the same category of Filipinos, which are different, completely different, and Chinese, who are also completely different. So there's that. How did that come about? How are the categories actually enforced? Why did some groups get included and some groups get excluded? People from South Asia were white for a while, and they lobbied and became Asian. The Italian groups lobbied to become non-white, but they never quite made it. They almost got recognized by the government. So it's a lot of really, it's a great thing about being a law professor. This is to be extremely interesting anyway. Love stuff I like to read about, so I get to spend my time doing that and writing about it. The writing part's actually much harder than the reading, admittedly. But there's even a little section about Jews and how Jews have been classified. You probably don't know this, but Hasidic Jews are actually classified as a non-white minority group, essentially, in many Department of Housing and Urban Development programs.
Wow. Did not know
so. Hey, all that great stuff.
Get on that.
Right. Wow. Interesting. Well, I'm going to obviously have to bring you back on this podcast to discuss your new book. So, let's. I'll look forward to hearing how that goes. And if you're behind on it, I'll ask David S. what's going on with it. And
I'll narc on him. Absolutely.
How about you, David S.?
Oh, so aside from this, is an incredibly fertile time for publishing, and one of the interesting things we're doing right now, and actually the New York Times of all places gave us some coverage of it last weekend.
I heard about that.
Yeah, we started a sub imprint called Emancipation Books that deals with all of these issues that we've discussed today: racial issues around ethnicity. in a very heterodox way. And it's, started off as, largely politically conservative and libertarian. But what the thing that's really interesting is that the mainstream publishing's view of these issues is so narrow that we're able to actually pick up things that are left of center, but they're still too heterodox even for mainstream publishing. For example, we're just announced we're doing a book by a woman named Angela Harrelson, who's George Floyd's aunt. And it's all about, the meaning behind her nephew's murder. And it woven in with her family story and how, he was, a troubled youth, like so many troubled youth in America, and how race determines what happens to a troubled young man. And it's a really fascinating take on the whole thing. But, it's not left, not right. It's just her own perspective. But it was not something that mainstream publishers felt like they could touch. Why? Because she's a devout Christian. And she talks about, how she views, faith as key to overcoming these divisions in America. Not something that Random House or Simon & Schuster has any interest in. So
in a way, is it sort of, are you in a way sort of a derivative of the same phenomena that is producing all these Substacks? Andrew Sullivan leaves, what is it, the New Yorker, and Glenn Greenwald leaves, I forgot what, and they're all Intercept, right?
Yeah.
And Barry Weiss leaves the New York Times, and all of a sudden they're the people being read. I don't know what's going to happen to Vox now that Matthew Iglesias is gone and all these other places, because they're the most interesting writers that these publications have, and they're writing great stuff, and people are even willing to pay for it. They're all making like tons of money too, and there must be a book. It must be the same phenomenon that's happening with books as well. When you're willing to publish those people that these other publishers aren't, you're benefiting from the best writing out there as well.
Yeah, the best writing, and also just the perspectives that people want to hear. The mainstream publishers are so they're so deep in a bubble. They're so deep in an East Coast urban bubble. That anything that doesn't, fit within that, they can't see why anybody would buy it, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Even if you go to small town America, right? You go to the local bookstores in small town America, they all look like a bookstore from East Village in Manhattan, right? They don't stock things that average Americans. Yeah. They just are literally catering to 10% of their potential audience.
Right. Well, you have Abigail Schreier's book, for example, that on trans rights and so forth, that was, I think, banned from Target for a period. I think it might still be. It came back and
it's still banned on Amazon.
Is it banned on Amazon?
Yeah.
Right. I think it was published by a sort of a religious-based publisher, because I don't think Random House would publish it. I know that Random House had that whole blow up about Jordan Peterson's book, where its own staff rebelled against it. I think it was Random House, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, it was. It was Random House Canada, I believe.
Right. Let me ask you a question. Isn't some of this really about their own internal dynamics? I mean, you saw this with the New York Times when Don McNeil, the great science reporter, got sort of canceled by 150 reporters and other staffers at the Times because of what he said or purportedly said, and yet. And you see this in Random House Canada with Jordan Peterson. Is it not just that they don't understand what the market is, but they're scared of their own staffers that they've hired over time?
That's a huge problem, and it's something we face. We're distributed through Simon and Schuster, and we've had a couple of books that we want to distribute either canceled or threatened to be canceled, because they have to have a town hall meeting every time they agree to distribute one of our books that offends their staff members. It's literally insane. What it forces you to do as an independent publisher is to think about, what your options are. And you do a lot of strategizing around getting out of the mainstream ecosystem, right? Where if a book, for example, if a book that we publish, Amazon decides to ban it, where are we going to sell it? Well, we have to build our own store. If Simon & Schuster won't distribute it, well, we have to find our own distribution channels, all of this stuff. And it's a huge business opportunity, but it's also a huge pain in the ass, frankly.
I'm not as famous as the other authors you mentioned, but I've written, this is my fifth sole author book. I haven't had no trouble finding publishers before. I'm thrilled to be publishing with Bombardier, but my original conception was as an academic university press book. And I have an agent. I have past publications. I sent it out to all the major university presses that publish law books. And it's not that the books got even rejected as such. Not a single press would send it out for review. Not Harvard University Press had published a book on a similar theme, but more historical. And I talked to the editor for an hour. He was really enthusiastic. He obviously wanted to go forward, but he got back to me and said, we can't go forward. And I assume the board of editors just vetoed it. And the book is not, even in its current trade press form, as opposed to, it's not especially polemical book. It's mostly quite positive in the philosophical sense of just explaining what happened and why.
It's a fascinating narrative is what it is.
Yeah.
That's why it appealed to me, because it's an incredible story.
And we're not talking about like a Simon and Schuster or basic books. For University Press, a book that sells 2,000 copies is a big seller. I have no doubt it'll do that, right? So it's not like they didn't think it was a market, but you couldn't even get past. Actually, my favorite is NYU Press, which allegedly specializes in like race books and whatever, but always left wing. My agent sent it to them at like 5:01. And at like 5:15, they sent a rejection email. So the editor, which meant that their editor didn't even bother reading the proposal.
Right. Well, maybe this is how illiberalism fails, in that that the institutions that distribute books and ideas and so forth become so stale themselves that no one actually pays attention to them, and that we actually end up rewarding the institutions that are willing to take chances, and that liberalism just finds other outlets to express itself.
So this is the flip side of what I said earlier about all the different outlets you have. So on the one hand, it lets the wackos get around the old gatekeeping problems. On the other hand, to the extent it's the mainstream that are being the gatekeepers and keeping out good ideas, or at least innovative ideas that should get a hearing, at least there are going to be other opportunities out there to get those ideas out.
Yep. Fascinating. Well, this has been a great conversation, as I expected it would. And maybe we'll do this every once in a while, as we talked about doing on Clubhouse. But I think this is a great way to doing it on a podcast and YouTube. And I appreciate your time and your great conversation.